The 19th century was a century of wonder, horror, and confusion. An age when science stumbled through the dark, reaching for light with trembling, blood-stained hands, in the flickering candlelight of London's back alleys, in Parisian hospitals heavy with ether and decay, and in the echoing halls of American medical schools. The practice of medicine was not yet a science. It was an experiment conducted upon the edge of faith and desperation, and of all the strange remedies that swept through the fevered imagination of Victorian healers, none was quite as disturbing or as symbolic as the act of drinking blood. To understand why otherwise rational men, physicians, philosophers, and surgeons placed their lips to that crimson life fluid, we must first step back into their world. Imagine the streets of London in 1846, before anesthesia, before germ theory, before the word sterile had any meaning in medicine. The fog clings to the gas lamps like dying breath. The hospitals are sanctuaries of suffering, places where people go to die more often than to heal. In those days, the body was a mystery machine. Blood, with its warmth and color, seemed the seat of the soul itself. When a man grew pale, they said his life was leaving him. When he bled, they said his spirit drained away. And so it made a dreadful, poetic kind of sense that to restore life, one might simply take in another's. In the 1800s, blood was not just a medical substance, it was an elixir of divine essence. The Bible spoke of life being in the blood. Ancient physicians had long described its four humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood, as the essential fluids that balanced the human condition. And when industrial Europe began its slow awakening to science, the new doctors carried the old myths inside their white coats. If life flowed through the veins, then surely consuming that essence could cure what was weak, pale, or dying within. Thus began the strange and short-lived era of hematophagy, the drinking of blood for health. One must not picture vampires in these halls, though the resemblance is uncanny. Instead, imagine a pale patient, thin as parchment, lying beneath the watchful eyes of a doctor who believes he has found nature's hidden remedy. The doctor's assistant, often a butcher by trade, brings in a bowl still warm from the slaughterhouse. The blood of a lamb, freshly taken, steams faintly in the winter chill. "Drink," says the physician softly. "The vitality of the creature will restore your own." The patient, trembling, obeys. The liquid is metallic, thick, still clotting as it slides down the throat. And somewhere in that grim moment, the line between science and superstition dissolves. The first real medical writings that mention blood consumption appear not in horror stories but in treatises on tuberculosis, the great wasting disease of the 19th century. Known as consumption, it was a slow, poetic death. Pallor, coughing blood, fading strength. Doctors noticed that sufferers looked drained of life. Some theorized that drinking fresh animal blood could replace what had been lost. Parisian physicians recommended warm ox blood. German healers preferred that of goats or lambs. In Britain, therapeutic blood drinking became a fashion among the wealthy sick, a practice whispered about in parlors, recorded in journals, and chronicled in the medical periodicals of the time. At the same time, medicine was transforming itself. Crude instruments of the Enlightenment, clashing with the mysticism of the medieval past. There were bloodlettings and transfusions, amputations and electric shocks, mercury tonics and laudanum dreams. Every doctor wanted to find a cure that worked, no matter how grotesque, and for a brief, fevered decade or two, drinking blood appeared to hold promise. Physicians wrote of improved vitality, rosy complexion, relief from melancholy. But none of them understood why. To them, the blood was a living warmth, a bridge between one body's strength and another's weakness. Of course, it wasn't entirely new. Ancient Rome had its own bloody rituals. Gladiator blood was said to cure epilepsy. Peasants in 17th century Europe believed the blood of the freshly executed held magical healing power. In some parts of rural England, hangmen were followed by desperate families with mugs and flasks, hoping to collect a few drops of the condemned man's essence before it touched the earth. By the 1800s, these folk superstitions were fading, but not forgotten. They had simply dressed themselves in the language of science. What was once witchcraft had become experimental therapy. One physician, Dr. Charles Bernard of Lyon, wrote in 1854 that fresh blood, taken from a healthy animal, should be imbibed while still warm, for in that state it most effectively transmits its vital energy. Another, Dr. Franz von Leube of Munich, observed that anemic women of nervous disposition benefit greatly from the drinking of lamb's blood daily. These were men of education, trained in universities, not mystics, yet their reasoning came from the same dark well as the alchemists before them. The act of drinking blood was both scientific and sacramental. The doctor became priest, the hospital an altar. But even as some physicians preached its virtues, others recoiled in disgust. The medical journals of the 1870s began to turn against the practice, calling it barbaric, repulsive, unfit for civilized medicine. Yet, ironically, blood transfusion, another form of giving life through blood, began to gain traction at the same time. The difference, of course, was one of method and meaning. The strange faith in blood did not end at the threshold of medicine. It spilled into the language, the poetry, and even the religion of the century. For the Victorians, blood was not only a medical curiosity, it was a metaphor for everything that pulsed with vitality or drained into despair. It colored their moral imagination. A strong man was said to have good blood. A family of noble heritage claimed blue blood. A criminal, a sinner, a pauper, he was one of bad blood. So, when a doctor prescribed the literal consumption of blood, he was not merely offering a cure. He was performing a symbolic act that reflected the entire moral architecture of his age. Picture the Victorian sanatorium, perched high above the fog and soot. It is quiet except for the faint rattle of a patient's cough and the scratch of the doctor's quill. On the long veranda, the dying sit wrapped in blankets, breathing the cold air like sacrament. Tuberculosis, the white plague, consumes them from within. They waste away, turning pale as ghosts. To the 19th century eye, they appear bled out by life itself. Their cheeks sink, their veins lie blue and still. And so, the physicians, caught between faith and desperation, seek to pour new blood into them. In one remote alpine sanatorium in 1857, a physician named Dr. Johann Riedel documented an experiment now largely forgotten. His patients, mostly young women, were instructed to drink half a cup of freshly drawn goat's blood each morning before sunrise. The blood, taken warm from the stable, was considered pure, untainted by human corruption. He recorded in his journals that after several weeks, some patients showed a visible return of color and renewed appetite. But others grew ill, feverish, delirious, repulsed by the very cure meant to save them. Riedel called it the paradox of vitality. he concluded, in poetic despair, that life cannot be swallowed. It must be kindled. This was the age when science and spirituality danced dangerously close together. Electricity, magnetism, mesmerism, phrenology, all seemed to promise some secret pathway between the material and the divine. The human body was not yet a system of cells and molecules, but a vessel for unseen forces. Blood, in particular, seemed charged with something sacred, the current of being itself. To drink it was to try to borrow another's essence, to sip from the pulse of creation. It was a kind of reverse crucifixion. Instead of giving one's blood for salvation, one consumed it to be reborn. And yet, beneath the candlelight of medical theaters and the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes, the practice carried a deeper unease. Doctors knew they were flirting with taboo. In Christian Europe, the symbolism of blood was both holy and forbidden. Communion offered the symbolic blood of Christ, wine transfigured, through faith. But to drink real blood was to cross into blasphemy. But blood is never simple. Its warmth deceives. In those unsterile days, contamination was a silent killer. Diseases, typhus, syphilis, brucellosis, could flow unseen in the crimson stream. Doctors noticed that some of their blood patients grew sicker. Still, many persisted. They argued that the problem was not the idea, but the purity of the source. The remedy fails only when the blood is corrupted. One article wrote, "It must be taken from the healthy, the young, the untainted." These words, innocent in their time, now echo with the early shadows of the eugenic thought that would haunt later generations. As the century deepened, a new anxiety began to replace faith in the old cures. The microscope, that small, glowing window into hidden worlds, began to show the truth that the naked eye could not. In 1847, Hungarian Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis proved that unseen filth carried death from one patient to another. In the 1860s, Louis Pasteur revealed that diseases came from microbes, not from bad air or corrupted fluids. Suddenly, the entire medical cosmology shifted. Blood was no longer a mystical essence, but a potential contagion. The same fluid that once promised life now harbored invisible death. The doctors who had once prescribed its drinking began, one by one, to abandon the practice. They washed their hands. They boiled their instruments. They turned away from the red cup. But even as science advanced, the human imagination refused to let go of blood. The year 1897 saw the publication of Dracula, a Gothic novel that transformed centuries of superstition into metaphor. Bram Stoker's vampire drank blood not for science, but for immortality, for desire, for the agony of never dying. It was as if the anxieties of an entire century, the fear of contagion, the allure of vitality, the guilt of consumption, had been distilled into one haunting symbol. What doctors once prescribed as medicine, the poets now wrote as curse. The vampire became the final, beautiful echo of the medical blood drinkers who came before. If you listen closely, you can still feel the strange symmetry of it all. The doctors of the 19th century and the monsters of their fiction were bound by the same dream to defy death, to steal a little more life, to sip from the warmth of another being and call it salvation. That is why their story still whispers to us in the dark, when we lie awake at night and feel the pulse in our wrists. Steady, fragile, ancient. For in the end, the tale of blood is the tale of humankind itself. Forever thirsty, forever searching for the secret of endurance in the thing that already flows within. By the middle of the 1800s, the world was transforming. steamships crossed oceans. Telegraphs pulsed through copper wires, and factories exhaled smoke like restless beasts. But inside hospitals and asylums, the air was still thick with the same scent of carbolic acid, candle wax, and blood. Doctors were now half priests, half engineers, standing at the fragile border between faith and machinery. Yet, even as microscopes revealed invisible kingdoms of bacteria and infection, there remained something seductive about the old notion that blood itself held life's deepest secret. When you read the medical journals of that era, the yellowed pages of the Lancet, Gazette Médicale de Paris, or Der Klinische Beobachter, you find the same quiet obsession echoing again and again. Vitality, restoration, reanimation. The word vitalism haunted every discussion. It was the idea that something beyond chemistry animated flesh, something that could not be seen under glass or isolated in a laboratory. And if such a force existed, surely it must dwell in the blood, that mysterious red tide that left the body cold when it ebbed away. The 19th century doctor was a man torn in two. One half of him worshipped reason, progress, science. The other half still knelt before the altar of mystery. Blood bridged both halves, both symbol and substance. To study it was modern, to revere it was ancient. In that tension, the old practice of drinking blood found its last gasp of legitimacy. It persisted not because it worked, but because it expressed something human, a yearning for direct contact with life itself, unmediated, unsterilized, raw. Consider the scene in a provincial English town around 1860. The local apothecary stands behind his counter, surrounded by jars of powdered opium and dried herbs. A mother enters, carrying a boy pale as winter milk. He has coughed up blood for days. The apothecary, trying to appear confident, remembers something he read in a medical circular. That fresh lamb's blood, taken warm, can strengthen the body against wasting disease. He sends a messenger to the butcher. Minutes later, a steaming basin arrives. The boy hesitates. His mother, desperate, whispers, "Drink, my love." He obeys, and as the iron taste fills his mouth, everyone in the room hopes, irrationally, fiercely, that this act of faith disguised as medicine will call him back from the edge. Such moments were repeated in hundreds of towns, under countless names. Some called it hematotherapy, others the sanguine cure. It was discussed with straight faces in parlors and medical halls alike. But even among believers, there was unease. Reports circulated of patients falling ill after drinking infected blood. Meanwhile, real medical progress moved slowly, unevenly. In 1818, James Blundell in London performed the first successful human-to-human blood transfusion, not for faith, but for necessity. Women dying of postpartum hemorrhage were given their husband's blood, transferred through a crude syringe and funnel. Some survived, some did not. Blundell himself admitted that the procedure was hazardous and uncertain. Yet, it captured the imagination. To give blood was to give life. To drink it was to claim that life for oneself. The two acts mirrored each other, reflections of the same desperate hope refracted through different lenses. One clinical, one mystical. By the late 1800s, the world began to split decisively between science and superstition. The laboratory replaced the altar. Hospitals became engines of precision rather than theaters of drama. Doctors began to wear white coats, symbols of purity and detachment. The bloody aprons of the early century disappeared, and yet, in the quiet corners of Europe, in remote villages, in poorhouses, in the forgotten colonies, people still whispered about the old cures. There were tales of shepherds in the Pyrenees who drank goat's blood for strength, of miners in Prussia who believed the blood of a young ox could stave off collapse, of midwives in Scotland who kept vials of pig's blood for women they thought were losing their essence after childbirth. The old belief refused to die. It simply went underground, merging with folklore, surviving where reason did not reach. In that sense, the story of blood drinking is not just medical but anthropological, a glimpse of how the human mind clings to symbols long after their logic fades. When science finally proved that blood was not the seat of the soul, only a carrier of oxygen, something beautiful and terrifying was lost. The world grew brighter, cleaner, safer, but also colder. The sacred became the sanitary. The red warmth of faith gave way to the blue chill of knowledge. And so, by the turn of the century, when you read the writings of men like William Hustler or Rudolf Virchow, the giants of modern medicine, you can sense a subtle mourning. They celebrated the end of ignorance, yes, but they also recognized what had been exorcised, that ancient intimacy between healer and mystery. The age of blood-drinking doctors had ended, but its shadow lingered in metaphor, in art, in the whispered Gothic pulse that still animates the stories we tell. In quiet moments, when they stood over the beds of dying patients, even the most rational physicians must have felt it. That old, inexplicable ache, the desire to reach into the body and pull back life itself. They no longer offered bowls of blood, but the yearning remained. For all our progress, the same question haunted them as it haunts us still. Where, exactly, does life reside? And what would we not do to keep it from slipping away?